Vice Grip by Matthew A. Goodwin. Read by Zachary Johnson. You know the thing about Vice? Vinny Rust Rusicano asked, stalking the garage with a screwdriver in one cybernetic hand and a cigar in the other. Stopping just in front of the man tied with electric cables to a chair with a burlap sack on his head, he said, "Everyone's got one." "Everyone," he repeated, and took a long drag from the cigar, smoke pooling above his head in a grim halo. "And as long as there's Vice, there will be people like me. People who will give the people what they want for a price they can afford." He grinned maniacally. Or not. The man in the sack said nothing. Vinny Rust grinned like a shark, showing microscreen teeth that flashed different colors. The light reflected in the blood on the sack. "Want to know how I became king of New Orleans?" he asked, not hearing his henchman sigh. They had heard this all before. Many times. Too many times. He loved to reminisce, to think back on the weak, skinny kid with no hope, who had taken over the streets of a city that chewed up and spit out people like him. It all started in a convenience store, he said, thinking back to that hot July so many years earlier. He and his friend Gian were sticky with perspiration, the mosquitoes buzzing around their heads as they pressed their faces against the glass to watch the screen. The Bayou Boys FC were taking on the Fishmongers to see who would play in the Cup that year. The clerk didn't mind the boys as long as they stayed outside and didn't bother the sad customers picking up their bottles of booze on their way home from work. They never stole anything. Not here. They would lift things from any other store in the city, but not this one. Not if they were allowed to watch the screens. As the players took to the sidelines at the half and the screen began to show a relentless onslaught of ads, Vinny reached down and wrung the sweat out of his shirt. He didn't notice the man walk into the store until he heard the commotion. The clerk was waving his hands defensively as the bald man wearing a gray three-piece suit loomed over the counter. He began to plead and cry as the massive brute grabbed him around the neck, the metallic hand glimmering in the fluorescent light of the shop. Vinny's eyes went wide as the clerk thrashed and kicked, sending packs of cigarettes, mints, and earbuds flying off the counter. The man's hand closed, and the commotion ceased. He let the body fall to the ground, turned, buttoned his suit, and walked out as though nothing had happened. The violence didn't bother Vinny. His whole life was violence. His father was violent to his mother, and his mother was violent to him. It was the way of things. The corporate overlords who lived in their glittering towers knew as little of Vinny's reality as he knew of theirs. But this man, the giant man wearing a suit in the summer, was a sight to behold. He was everything Vinny wanted to be. He possessed the authority of a company man, but was on the level of the streets. Vinny knew two things in that moment. He wanted to be like the man, to wield that casual power. And he wanted an arm like that. As the man strode out, he turned, meeting Vinny's gaze. "You see anything?" the man asked. His voice was low and menacing. Vinny shook his head. "No," he stammered. "No, sir." The edge of the man's lip curled up slightly. He had a friendly face with deep brown eyes, which belied his obvious threat. "Good boy," he said with a wink, and Vinny looked over his shoulder to discover that he was alone. Gian had fled. Vinny knew he should do the same. But he couldn't. And his feet started moving as though independent of his body. After a few steps, he caught up with the man who turned a cold eye on him. "Don't bother asking for money," he said, and though he spoke the words calmly, there was an unmistakable undertone. "No, sir," Vinny said as the man moved toward a black town car hovering near an oak tree dripping with Spanish moss, just out of the view of the store's cameras. The man nodded and laughed. Vinny had not been expecting that. "Listen, kid," the man said in an unnervingly amiable tone. "There's 1,000 street rats just like you who want to be tough guys. But trust me, you don't." Vinny smiled. That winning smile that had gotten him out of so many dicey situations in the past. No, sir, there are other kids like me. And I don't want to be a tough guy. I want that. He pointed to the cybernetic arm protruding from the jacket sleeve. He couldn't stop staring at it, looking at it the way his friends looked at fancy cars or his father looked at the girls on the corners. The man smirked. Whoa, no shit. Get a load of this guy, he said to no one in particular. You want to earn this kind of money? You gotta work for it. Vinny was in a state of near entire mesmerization as the man spoke, watching his robotic thumb and forefinger rub together. He did. The giant man who later introduced himself as Paulie Two Socks put him to work right away. Vinny was never able to quite understand how he had worked up the courage to follow him that night and ask for work. But now that he had, he was in. Paulie wasn't a boss, but a lieutenant, an enforcer. He kept people in line and made sure the local populace knew who ran the streets. But he was also an earner. He intercepted and robbed trucks that the pharmaceutical giant LOTP used to ferry drugs around. Paulie would loot the trucks, replace the pill bottles with plastic baggies, and sell the pills for slightly less than the company. More accurately, Vinny sold the pills for slightly less. Paulie had been right about one thing. There were a lot of street rats all scurrying around to deliver the goods for the family. But Vinny had been right too. None of them were like him. He began to understand his regulars and identify the true junkies. When he made the deliveries to those too whacked out to know their ass from a hole in the ground, he would pocket one pill, swapping it for a sugar tablet he would steal from a pharmacy. These pills he would sell to his friends before insisting that they crush them up and do all the drugs together. It was on one of those nights when Vinny, eyes glassy and streaked with crimson, said, I have to do something. Do what? Gian asked. Vinny had gotten his friend a job as soon as he could. Gian was good at the work, but too kind for Vinny's taste. His friend was an easy target for the hopheads, who could always convince him to give them just one extra pill. The two were sitting in a shabby apartment in a 50-story high-rise tenement of shabby apartments. Roaches of both kinds littered the broken and splintered hardwood floor. Vinny was sick of this place. He had been working for Paulie for 2 years, but was still just a runner. He wanted more. Needed more. Something big, Vinny said, standing up so fast that he knocked the beer off the armrest of the tattered wine-colored couch where it had been precariously perched. He took no note of the spilled drink as the liquid puddled at his feet. What's the worst addiction in the city? Drugs! Gian exclaimed as though he was on a game show. The cadaverous people who littered the halls of the building were certainly a testament to his point. Vinny shook his head. Sex, Gian said, standing this time and pointing widely. Vinny shook his head again, and when Gian said nothing, he nearly whispered, virtual escape. His own brother had been a digital junkie. Like so many of the suffering poor, he needed to escape his brutalizing real life for a serene, synthesized one. Having to exist outside his virtual existence made him irritable, and he was always waiting for his next plug-in. The family understood the extent of the addiction when he flipped the dinner table, not remembering he was in the real world. Vinny's parents couldn't afford rehab. That shit is for elites anyway. He will muscle through, Vinny's father sneered, as though he had ever been able to kick his own sex addiction or convince his wife to stop gambling. Vinny's brother did not muscle through, eventually finding a pirated copy of The Mass Illusion, the most popular virtual world, and dying when his bed sores became infected. Vinny had been sad, but not at the death. He was sad that his brother had succumbed to his addiction, given in to that internal weakness that plagued his whole family. Vinny swore then he would only take sex, drugs, alcohol, and digital escape in small doses. Your cousin still work at Mass Illusion Industries? He asked Gian. He nodded, noting, but he won't want to lose that job. No one who had a job could afford to lose it, and Vinny knew it. He won't lose a job if he just lets slip a delivery location. Tell him there will be a fat payout, and I'll make sure it's delivered by the most beautiful woman he ever saw. Vinny had a singular talent for understanding people's needs, and Gian's cousin, an infamous Lothario, would never turn down such an offer. He was right, and 2 weeks later he and Gian were on rooftops on either side of Dumaine Street, waiting for the truck to pass. As expected, it had 2 guard vehicles flying alongside it. Vinny was prepared. He had spent all his meager savings and borrowed against his next 3 months' wages to get the supplies for the heist. He nodded to the hacker he had hired, and the scrawny girl did something on her computer as Vinny stood with the launcher on his shoulder. The girl clacked away on her keyboard, and the 2 guard vehicles plummeted to the ground. As a means of earning a little extra income on the job, he had tipped off some scrappers, who instantly made their way into the street to strip the cars. Vinny fired the snare cable, one end sinking a hook into the side of the armored transport, with the other end already connected to the exposed rebar on the roof. The vehicle's computers tried to adjust and pull the car free. Vinny watched as the machine pulled wildly against the cable. The rebar began to bend and wail. Vinny had been warned that hacking the transport would take time, but he was impatient. "Do it now!" he snarled at the hacker, who ignored him and continued to do her work in silence. The moment the transport fell, Vinny was scrambling down the cables, his gloves ripping and tearing as he moved. The scrappers were already pulling the machine apart when Vinny hit the ground. "The One Worlds are mine," he warned them, speaking of the loot within the back of the truck. The poor people like his brother, who craved escape but couldn't afford the subscription fees of places like the Mass Illusion, could save up and buy a One World. The chips would load a one-time-use, 12-hour digital universe onto the user's computer, and they could escape their drudgery for half a day. Paulie had his rats selling knockoff versions, but only the most desperate junkies ever used them. The second the door to the truck was off, Gian and Vinny were stuffing their bags with chips. People emerged from their homes and businesses, but scurried back inside when they saw what was happening. They feared what would come next. The Carcer Corporation, a private security firm who policed the city, would be closing in soon. The hacker was scrambling communications, but Vinny knew he only had a little time. Chips were getting caught in the tears in his gloves as he continued the theft. His heart raced. He knew this was the moment that could define his life. It did. As he was sitting across from Paulie at the cafe, he explained, "We got clear before Carcer arrived. I have the chips in the back of my car." Paulie looked at him with an unfamiliar gaze. Was it pride? "You did good, kid," he said, lifting a dainty cup of coffee in his huge hand. "And you did right coming to me first. Lots of kids, when they get their first big score, forget who they work for. They go straight to the boss. That would have been an error in judgment." Vinny nodded subserviently. "I'll never forget who got me here," he told the man. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't a truth either. He was already working the back channels to let the boss know exactly who had brought this score in. He knew how much he owed Paulie, but he also knew the man was trying to hold him back, keep him in line. "Just make sure I get my cut," Vinny noted, his friendly tone belying his intentions. Gian was already lining up buyers for the third of the score Vinny wasn't presenting to Paulie. The huge man dabbed his brow with a handkerchief before taking a bite of the beignet, sending powdered sugar snowing down his chin. "You'll get your cut," he said through a full mouth. Vinny's cut was smaller than he wanted, but it was enough. He went to Doc, the crew's surgeon, and said bluntly, "I want an arm." The old woman, with only a few black streaks in her graying hair, looked up at him lazily. "So I keep hearing," she smiled, a tired, disinterested smile. She wore a dirty, worn lab coat whose good days, if it ever had any, were long past. "I knew you'd be shadowing my door sooner or later." She talked him through the procedure, and before he knew it, he was waking up on the metal frame cot in an exposed, brick-walled room that served as a recovery suite. With blurry half-consciousness, He looked at the arm. It didn't matter to him that it was a rusted old machine arm with twin-end affixers instead of fingers, or that it was pried off an unlucky soul who couldn't afford last month's payments. To him, it was dream fulfillment. The parts whirred loudly as they moved and manipulated the air, and Vinny grinned. He remembered back to being 12 and stealing a bottle of whiskey from BYO Liquor down the street from his apartment. The alcohol helped him sleep in the still heat of the small room he shared with his brother, and made it possible to drown out the street noise and constant screams from his parents. 3 boys a few years his senior stopped him with a hand to the chest. He clutched the booze hard and called, "It's mine!" even as they were beating him. His new arm would have saved him. He would have been able to hit the boys right back and keep what was his. It was power. It was a strength his slight form would never possess. He clutched the frame of the cot and felt the metal bend and buckle in his grip. For the first time in his life, he felt one part of his body matched the might of his mind. "Ooh," Polly said with an exaggerated whistle when Vinny strode into the cafe a few days later. "Look at that hunk of junk. Vinny boy's got a new toy." Then, to the assembled thugs, he laughed and pointed. "Check this out. What, did you lift that off some grandma? That's rustier than a ginger's ball sack. Vinny Rust. Boys, come in here and take a look at old Vinny Rust." Vinny's face burned and his natural fist balled in fury. He was used to razzing and ball-busting, but having his new pride and joy mocked brought his ire up. His heart thumped against his chest as he tried to take calming breaths. He smiled and laughed along, but knew then what he had to do. "He catches you, they'll find you belly up in the river," the hacker warned a few months later when Vinny had positioned himself to make his move. "I know that," he hissed. "Just get it done clean and we'll both be richer for it." She nodded, her face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. Streams of words and numbers cascaded over the screen. Hacking Carcer data fortresses was no easy task, and Vinny had promised the young hacker who had gained a reputation as being the best in the city a huge sum of money he didn't possess for the job. It was no matter. Her puffed up and feathered hair tickled his nose as he loomed over her, watching the work he didn't fully understand. "All right," she said finally. "I got a file created." He nodded. "Good," he said. "Thank you. For everything." Her shoulders tensed at the words. She knew. He knew she knew. As quick as a snake's strike, his new arm darted out, pinching her neck. Her arms reached back, clawing at him. She couldn't cry out, but she kicked, her legs crunching against the heavy wood desk. Then he remembered the clerk. The same desperate movements, the same understanding of what was happening. A rush surged through him as he felt the power he witnessed all that time ago. He was the killer now. He was the force to be reckoned with. As she slumped down, limbs dangling like a rag doll, Vinny smiled. He felt no remorse. He didn't care that the world had one fewer poor, sad person in it. He felt strong, truly powerful for the first time in his life. He wanted more. More parts to replace his weaknesses. He tossed her to the floor, dirt and dust dancing all around her body. His plan was in motion, and soon he would take this city in his rusty grip. Like a man reborn, he stepped out onto the hacker's ramshackle porch after snatching the data chip from her computer. Lights from the surrounding shacks glimmered against the swamp, and cicadas buzzed in an oppressive cacophony like that of the ceaseless delivery drones downtown. The scent of frying catfish filled his nostrils. The edible form of the fish was long gone from the polluted lakes and lagoons, but the locals kept their cultural heritage alive by bioreplicating the animals in vats. False fish were one of Paulie's neglected rackets, and Vinny would see that changed. He got into his car and it lifted, scattering the children gawking from the shrubs. He set coordinates for Apotheosis, the nightclub where the boss spent his evenings. The man who ran the city's underworld had erased his name from the records. He was called the Boss the way a black hat used their handle. It would not keep Carcer from placing a lofty bounty on him, but he always argued, it's better to stay anonymous. Vinny was a man on a mission as he pushed his way through the sweaty mass of humanity. The hopped-up forms writhing against one another in the thrumming noise and flashing lights were little more than false props to him as he made his way to the staircase. "Vinny Rust," the boss called out, waving him over. Vinny felt one of his teeth crack as his jaw clenched at hearing the moniker. "Gotta talk to you," Vinny said. He hated his high-pitched voice with a Louisiana twang, and vowed then to get a modulator installed to remedy it. The boss stood and smoothed his purple velour suit before running his hands through slicked-back hair. "Lots of folks need to speak with me today," he noted ominously as he guided Vinny into an office. The strung-out club owner could barely lift his head, but scurried from the office on rubber legs when he laid glossy eyes on the boss. The boss was a head taller than Vinny, dark and intimidating. His baritone voice and muscular frame gave him a commanding presence Vinny envied. "What's up, kid?" the boss asked, narrowing his eyes at the young man. The boss had taken a shine to Vinny over the years. Vinny was always sure to show deference when they met, and presented small gifts whenever he could. In a world of hard men being cruel, the small kindnesses were welcomed. Vinny was still brimming with confidence and set his shoulders. "Paulie's working with Carcer." He let the words hang, but if the boss had a reaction, he didn't let Vinny see it. "He said something similar about you," he said simply. There was no emotion in his words, but Vinny knew he had to tread lightly. He was not surprised by the revelation. He knew Paulie feared his underling's growing stature. "I heard some rumblings," Vinny began. "People saying Paulie was going behind our backs. So I had a friend of ours do a little digging." He produced the chip and stepped behind the desk, socketing it into the computer. The projected screen displayed the list of street informants. In just a flash of a moment, a slight micro-expression of rage passed over the boss's face as he saw Paulie's name. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said, the mask of serenity back in place. "It'll be sorted." That was to be the end of the discussion, but Vinny pressed his luck. He had come this far and wouldn't see some other guy promoted when it could be him. Should be him. "How's about I sort it for you?" he offered. Just as he had those years earlier. He was taking a big risk, which could potentially change his life forever. "I see it done and I take his business. To show my gratitude, I'll ensure a 10% increase in profit in the first month." Vinny was hoping for a reaction, but the boss simply locked him in the eyes. The bass from the music below vibrated into Vinny's feet as he waited. The boss nodded. Vinny sat in the passenger side of the van as John drove. It had taken nearly 6 months for him to get the word from the boss that he could make his move. But the day was finally upon him. "I better see you at my kid's first birthday," John said by way of reminder. Vinny had no interest in a child's birthday party. A bunch of snot-nosed rugrats and their sad parents swapping baby war stories was his idea of hell. But he knew it was important to his only friend. "I'll be there," he said absently, staring out the window at row after row of houses with black wrought-iron-cased balconies. John had a kind heart. Vinny thought he was a fool. Where Vinny saw opportunity, his friend saw people who needed help. When a young hooker showed up at the club with a battered face, John had rushed out to find her pimp. Vinny hadn't cared that John had found the love of his life in the wounded girl, only that his pal had taken over the prostitution ring and kicked up a percentage. When their daughter was born, Vinny had said simply, "Congratulations, don't let it affect your work." "They just grow up so fast," John said. "You know, you hear people say it, but you don't really know until you're a parent. I swear it was just yesterday I was bringing her home from the hospital, and now she can point to her belly. Can you believe that? She's so smart, I keep saying." But Vinny cut him off. "Hush up. he said with his new synthesized voice. "We're getting close." Gian fell silent, and the lackey in the back of the van stubbed out his cigarette. Vinny held the machine pistol in his natural hand, knowing it was the last time he would have to use the worthless flesh. The van pulled up in front of the cafe. He expected Paulie to run, to get up and flee like a coward. But the massive man just looked at the kid he had plucked out of obscurity and smiled. The man would meet his death the same way he had lived his life. Vinny seethed as he raised the weapon. He hated that Paulie could die bravely, with a smile. He felt robbed of the satisfaction of showing his mentor how far he had come. The shots thundered through the street, scattering onlookers and blood. Screams of terror could be heard from all around as Vinny stepped through the smoke, spitting on the corpse. "Fucking rat!" he cried for all to hear. Word of this would spread and everyone would know now who ran the streets. No one would call Carcer, no one would pay to have this investigated. Vinny scooped up Paulie's legs as the lackey and Gian grabbed his huge shoulders. They loaded Paulie into the van and began a quiet drive to dock. "Back again," she said with a tone slightly too judgmental for Vinny's liking. When he awoke, Vinny looked down as he had the first time. Jubilation filled him as he lifted the new arm. That arm which he had so long coveted. It moved silently and precisely, the way his weak, natural arm had. He touched the metallic thumbs to each forefinger, grinning at each satisfying little click. The workmanship was pristine. The machinery was constructed by industry-leading Osaka Cybernetics, but the facade had been perfectly crafted by Sicilian artisans. Obsidian black with etched gold trim styled to look like growing vines on the hills of Italy. It was the most beautiful thing Vinny had ever seen. He was becoming a work of art. He kept his antiquated arm on the other side, as a reminder of where he had come from, but this new arm represented where he was going. He would be a powerhouse of mind constructed of metal. He would be as feared for his strength as he had been respected for his prowess. Doc looked at him with an expression he didn't recognize but took for absolute awe. As he stepped out onto the street, he surveyed his dominion. He breathed in deep, watching the denizens look at him and run. He had what he desired. The scrawny kid was now a force, if not of nature, then of human will. The sensation filled every ounce of him, and he wanted more, needed this feeling to last. When he brought all the local pimps to heel, he celebrated with high-definition eyes, capable of analyzing a situation and relaying information directly to his brain. When he doubled the profits of the drug runners by further diluting each dose, he replaced his legs so he could tower over all the people who had looked down on him. When he boosted a weapons truck bound for the local Carcer facility, selling the guns on the streets, he used the money to procure a top-of-the-line cybernetic heart. His pathetic, weak-willed father had succumbed to a heart attack a year earlier, and Vinny swore that no such fate would befall him. "The commission is worried," the boss said. Vinny sat across the long table from him in the back room of Bella Trattoria. "That hit against Carcer was too brazen. They need you to lay low a little while they grease some palms." Vinny scowled. He couldn't believe that anyone would tell him what to do. He had become the biggest earner in the organization, and had brought in more money over the last several years than anyone. "The commission don't tell me what to do." The boss's lip twitched, nearly imperceptibly. "No, you're right," he said slowly. "They tell me what to do, and I tell you what to do." Vinny felt the fire within him begin to blaze into an inferno. The man before him was the boss, the most powerful man in all the southern city-states, and he was allowing himself to be ordered around. It disgusted Vinny. "You're going to pull me off the streets?" he seethed through flashing microscreen teeth. The boss sighed slowly, letting the air escape his lips for what felt like an hour. "Just for a bit. You'll keep your take and be back at it in no time." "I didn't see them fucking complaining when I was bringing in assloads of cash!" Vinny screamed. He was furious. No one could tell him to take a break. He was too mighty, too great to be ordered around by some group of nobodies out east. The boss leaned forward, the cushion of his chair exhaling at the shift in weight. His face was cast into shadows as he steeped his fingers and said, "This isn't a request. Don't make me remind you how things work, and do not make me repeat myself. Capiche?" The door opened behind Vinny and 2 enforcers stepped into the room. "Yes, sir," Vinny said, like the little boy outside the convenience store. He stood and locked eyes with one of the men. His grim expression read, "Don't do it." But Vinny was not going to take orders from anyone. Not from some bruiser and not from a man who wouldn't defend him to the commission. It happened in a flash. Vinny's new fist cracked one man's skull so badly it got stuck for a moment in the cavity. The other man moved on him, grabbing him around the neck with a metal arm of his own. Vinny wouldn't be like the clerk or the hacker. He wouldn't flail like a rat caught in a trap. His vision began to blur as he used his rusted pinchers to grab the man's testicles. The pop was drowned out by the scream. Vinny sucked in air as he was released, wheeling on the man and kicking him through the wall with his robotic legs. The boss, the man who never showed any emotions, looked at Vinny in terror. Vinny grinned maniacally. The most powerful man he had ever known was now seeing him for the god that he was. The look on the boss's face was everything Vinny had ever wanted, and he drank it in like an alcoholic having his first beer after work. The boss produced a gun from the desk and fired shot after shot into his chest. The bullets struck the nanomesh skin, before falling uselessly to the ground. He felt the pain, and his ribs would be damaged, but he would be fine. He strode over and looked down at the scared man with delight. "No one tells me what to do anymore," he grinned, his eyes focused. He took the boss's forehead between his fingers, Paulie's fingers, and began to squeeze. The commission would be after him now. But if he could fend them off and promise them money, he could take the top job in the city. He could be the man his new body demanded. But he would need to hide and gather his troops if he was going to last long enough to do that. It worked. Against all odds, it worked. The commission didn't want to start a war, and Vinny figured that they were too scared of him to try to oust him. He had been forced to make a sizable donation to the Carcer Committee on Civic Safety, and promised not to steal from the company again, but that was no matter. He had become the boss, and he was satisfied as his car dropped onto the landing pad outside Gion's estate in the Garden District. A bounce house was set up, and kids splashed in the pool as Vinny stepped out. He watched as the adults covered their mouths as they saw him emerge. Gian hustled over, giving his friend an unwanted hug. "You made it," he said, but there was a hint of sadness in his voice. "I wouldn't miss your kid's 5th birthday for the world," he lied, wishing he was anyplace else. He liked the attention his arrival had garnered, but as soon as the parents went back to drinking and eating their barbecue, his temporary enjoyment vanished. "Come have a drink with me," Gian offered, putting his hand on Vinny's back and guiding him to the house. He guided Vinny through the palatial plantation house of white walls lined with fine art. A drudge, the ubiquitous robot servants, brought 2 glasses of fine bourbon as they reclined on plush leather couches in the study. Vinny couldn't help but chuckle at the things his friend wasted money on. "Look, Vince, we need to talk," Gian said. Vinny huffed and chuckled. "You breaking up with me?" Gian didn't laugh. He just looked sullen and took a sip. "I need out," he said softly. "I've got more money than I could ever spend, and now I want to spend time with my family." Vinny could not believe what he was hearing. "You want out," he mocked. "You don't just get out." Gian shook his head. "I can, if you'll let me," he nearly whispered. "And what if I won't let you?" Vinny shouted, his vision blurring with anger. Gian took another drink. "You will, because I'm your oldest friend and you love me." Vinny felt his face burn. He had loved Gian. but he hated this feeble creature who was trying to leave him. He couldn't understand. What's this about? Money? No! Gian exclaimed. I just said it isn't about money. It's never been about money for me. I only ever did this because it's what you wanted. I wanted to help you, to protect you, but you don't need me anymore. Vinnie Rust doesn't need me. The words hurt worse than when he had been shot. He began to hate the man standing before him, this former friend who now wanted to turn his back on him. I can't believe you. How long have you been this way? Been this way, Gian said with a disgusted laugh. I've always been what I am. But why don't you try taking a look in the mirror? You've become a machine. A literally heartless robot no different than a drudge. Vinnie took a step toward Gian, metal palm opened. He stopped. The pathetic weakling wasn't even worth his time. What I've become, he sneered, is powerful. You want out? Fine. Get out. You have my blessing. Go live some life where your only fucking legacy is that little brat outside. He began to stomp from the room, but turned, pointing an accusatory finger etched with gold. But I never want to see your face again. You want out, then you're dead to me. Storming away, he heard Gian call after him. I love you, Vince! He didn't care. Meaningless words from a meaningless man. He slammed the door to his car so hard it burst the hinges, falling to the ground below as he drifted into the sky. He thought about the betrayal the whole ride home. The man who had always prided himself on seeing everyone for who they were had been fooled. It wouldn't happen again. His mind was getting soft and he needed to fix it. No one would play Vinnie Rust again. Vinnie pulled the burlap sack from the man's face and his mouth fell open. He didn't understand. Didn't know what he was looking at. The face staring back at him was his own. Blinking hard, he felt the chair under him. He looked at his hands to see the screwdriver slick with blood. And as he opened the other, an implant. The side of his head felt cold. He thought back, trying to remember. He had left Gian's house and gone straight to the dock. I want the N900 neural chip, he had demanded. It was the only way. The cognition implant would raise the level of his mind to that of his body. Doc looked at him, her whole body shaking in dread. She shook her head violently. No, she wailed. He pointed to the chip in the display case. You have it! I want it! No, she said again. It's for display purposes only. You need a surgeon supervised by several company technicians to install something like that. You're a doctor, he snarled. You can do it! She shook her head, holding her hands up and beginning to weep as he moved closer. I can't. It would kill you. She was pathetic, weak, and useless. Vinnie may have been fooled once, but he was strong and smart and could figure anything out. Seeing red, he smashed the case and snatched the chip. Fine! I'll do it myself! He screamed as he left. She called after him, but the words fell on deaf ears. That was it. He looked at the screwdriver again, seeing a bit of his brain matter on the tip of the drill bit. He understood. There was no burlap sack, no judgmental thugs. There were only the delusions of a dying mortal mind sitting alone in a vacant warehouse. He had come so far, accomplished so much. But he would soon be just another body in the bayou. He had been born weak and chased strength too far. With every augment he had descended deeper into addiction. Vinnie now knew what he was. He was his parent. He was his brother. His head dropped, black closing in on his vision. His own words echoed in his mind. You know the thing about vice.